They found the first team's radio 3 weeks later. Still on, still transmitting. Nobody answered it. 12 soldiers went into that valley, across 2 separate missions. 12 soldiers with training, with weapons, with everything the military could give them. Not one came back. So when the commanders sat down to decide who goes in next, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Nobody raised their hand. Nobody except her. And the room, full of generals, full of medals, full of men who had been making life and death decisions since before she was born, laughed. What she did next in that valley, alone, in the dark, they will never laugh again. The briefing room smelled like stale coffee and old decisions. 12 men sat around a long oak table covered in maps, satellite images, and casualty reports. The fluorescent light above buzzed faintly, the kind of sound you only notice when everything else goes quiet. And right now, everything had gone quiet. Because First Lieutenant Maya Reeves had just raised her hand. General Harlan Cole looked at her the way a man looks at something he doesn't quite understand. His reading glasses sat low on his nose. His medals caught the light. He had 40 years of war behind his eyes, and not a single second of doubt in his posture. "You," he said. Not a question, barely even a word. "Yes, sir." Maya kept her voice flat, controlled. She had learned a long time ago that showing emotion in this room was the same as handing someone a weapon to use against you. The silence held for exactly 3 seconds. Then Colonel Briggs laughed first. It wasn't a subtle laugh. It came from his chest, loud, genuine, the kind of laugh that gives other people permission to laugh too. And they did. Not all of them, but enough. Enough that the sound filled the room and pressed against Maya from every direction like something physical. She didn't move. On the table in front of them was a mission folder stamped in red, Operation Silent Ridge. The objective was straightforward in the way that suicide missions are always called straightforward. A ghost unit of enemy combatants had taken position inside a narrow mountain valley 60 kilometers behind the forward line. They had already taken out 2 reconnaissance teams, 12 men total, no survivors, no recovered bodies. Signal intelligence suggested they had a forward observer embedded somewhere on the ridgeline, feeding coordinates to a mortar position that had been hitting the base camp every 48 hours like clockwork. Someone needed to go in, move on foot through 4 kilometers of exposed terrain, locate the observer, eliminate the mortar team, get out before the next airstrike window closed. Every senior field officer in the room had already quietly passed on it. Maya had not. "Lieutenant Reeves," General Cole set down his pen carefully, the way you set something down when you're choosing your next words. "This isn't a rescue op. It isn't surveillance. You go in alone until the support element can reach the secondary position, and that's a 6-hour gap minimum. In that valley, at night, against a unit that's already killed a dozen of our people. I know what it is, sir." Another ripple of reaction around the table. You didn't interrupt General Cole. That was simply not something that happened. Cole studied her. Why you? It was a real question. She could hear that underneath it. Maya had thought about how to answer this for the last 4 hours, since she first read the mission file that someone had left on the wrong desk, or maybe the right one. She had run the terrain in her head. She had mapped the approach angles. She had thought about the 2 recon teams and what they likely did wrong, and she was almost certain she knew. But she didn't say any of that. "Because I can read that valley, sir. I grew up in terrain like it, and because—" She paused, just half a second. No one else raised their hand. The room went quiet again, a different kind of quiet this time. Briggs stopped smiling. Cole looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked down at the folder, then back at her. "Denied. We'll wait for the drone window to open on Thursday and reassess." Maya nodded once. "Yes, sir." She walked out of the briefing room, down the corridor, past the row of unit photographs on the wall, and out into the sharp, cold air of the forward operating base. The mountains were visible from here, dark shapes against a darker sky, massive and indifferent. She stood there and breathed. Thursday was 4 days away. The mortar position would fire again in 48 hours. That meant one strike before Thursday, probably hitting the eastern quarter of camp where the medical unit had relocated last week. She already knew what she was going to do. She had known before she walked into that room. The raised hand, the request, the formal denial, that wasn't her asking for permission. That was her making sure that when this was over, no one could say she acted without warning them first. She went back to her bunk, ate, checked her gear slowly and methodically, the way her father had taught her to check gear, which was the same way his father had taught him. Every buckle, every seal, every round. She slept 4 hours, clean, deep sleep, no dreams. At 0200 she was awake. At 0230 she was gone. The base perimeter camera on the north side had a 12-second rotation gap that the security team had been meaning to fix for 3 weeks. Maya had counted it 6 times over the past month, out of habit, the way she counted everything, not because she planned to use it, but because she always wanted to know. Now she used it. She moved through the gap, through the outer wire and out into the darkness beyond the floodlights. The cold hit her immediately, deep, bone-level cold that came off the mountains at this hour like a warning. She kept moving. Behind her, the base hummed with generators and sleeping men, and the sound of a war that had been going on so long that people had started to forget what it felt like before it. Ahead of her, 4 kilometers of open ground, and then the valley where 12 soldiers had already disappeared. She thought about the laughing in that room. She thought about Briggs's face. Then she stopped thinking about it entirely, because thinking about it burned energy she needed for something else. The mountain waited. She walked toward it. The first kilometer was the easiest and the most dangerous. Easy because the terrain was relatively flat, dry scrubland broken by shallow ditches and the occasional boulder that offered brief cover. Dangerous because flat ground in a combat zone is a lie. It feels safe until it isn't, and by the time you realize it isn't, the decision has already been made for you. Maya moved low and slow, not running, never running unless the situation forced it, because running made noise, and noise in the dark was the same as standing under a spotlight. She had learned this not in any training manual, but from her grandfather, who had hunted in terrain like this before Maya's mother was born. He used to say that the land always hears you before you hear it. Your job is to make that gap as small as possible. She kept that in her head now like a compass bearing. The temperature had dropped another 2 degrees since she left the wire. She could feel it in her fingers despite the gloves. A deep, pressing cold that would become a real problem if she had to stay still for too long. She noted it, filed it, kept moving. At the 1.2-kilometer mark, she stopped behind a rock formation and spent 4 minutes just listening. This was something the 2 failed recon teams had almost certainly skipped. She had read both mission debrief attempts, the fragmented radio logs, the partial GPS tracks recovered from one of the team leaders' watches. Both teams had moved at pace, efficient, tactically sound by the book. They had treated the valley like a route to cross rather than a thing to understand. That was the mistake. This valley was not a route. It was a system. It had its own sounds, its own rhythms, its own logic. The wind moved through it in a specific pattern determined by the ridgeline shape on the eastern wall. That pattern meant sound traveled upward and northeast, which meant anyone on the valley floor made noise that funneled directly toward the high ground on the right. The recon teams had moved along the left wall instinctively, thinking they were using the shadow. They were actually broadcasting every footstep toward the ridgeline like a radio signal. Maya had worked this out from the topographic maps and 2 hours of thinking in her bunk. She could not be certain she was right, but she was certain enough to move differently. She kept to the center of the valley floor, low, following the dry riverbed that ran down the middle. The riverbed was uneven and slow-going, rocks and silt and sudden drops that she had to feel for with each step rather than see. But the center of the valley created a dead zone acoustically. Sound going up split around her and rejoined above. It wasn't perfect. Nothing was perfect. But it was better. She moved this way for 40 minutes. Then she heard it. Not a voice, not a footstep. Something smaller, a shift of weight on loose stones somewhere above and to her right. The kind of sound that your brain almost doesn't register as significant, files it under wind or animal, moves on. Maya stopped completely. She controlled her breathing down to almost nothing. Long, slow draws through her nose. She had practiced this so many times that it was less a technique now and more a biological state she could switch into, like dropping a gear. She waited. 90 seconds passed. Then she saw the ember. Just for a half second, someone on the ridgeline had drawn on a cigarette and then covered it again quickly. Amateur mistake, but it told her everything she needed. Position, rough elevation, and the fact that whoever was up there was cold and tired and making small errors. Cold and tired people make more errors as time goes on. That was useful. She marked the position in her mind, 30 degrees above horizontal, approximately 200 meters up the eastern face, slightly south of the rock formation that looked like a broken jaw from the valley floor. She had noted that formation on the map. She had even given it a name in her head during planning. She called it the chair. The observer was sitting just below the chair. Now she had to decide. The observer was the eyes feeding the mortar team. Eliminate the observer and the mortar team fires blind. But a shot, even a suppressed one in this cold air, would echo differently than ambient noise and might alert the mortar position, which her map suggested was another 400 meters further along the ridge at a lower elevation, tucked behind the northern wall, where it would be protected from counter-battery and nearly invisible from the air. She needed to reach the mortar position first, fix its exact location, and then work backward. Take the mortar team, then the observer, in a window tight enough that neither could warn the other. This required getting up the eastern face without being seen by the man she had already located. She studied the terrain for 11 minutes without moving. This is the part that separates soldiers from warriors. Not the willingness to move, but the discipline to stay still long enough that when you do move, you move correctly. She identified a gully running diagonally up the face, approximately 40 meters south of her current position. It was in shadow. It angled away from the observer's sightline. The footing would be poor but manageable. She began moving toward it. Halfway there, a sound stopped her cold. Voices. Below her. Behind her. 2 men, speaking quietly, moving along the valley floor from the south entrance, the direction of the base. They were moving fast and careless, the way people move when they think they know where they're going. Maya pressed flat behind a boulder and processed this in real time. Not enemy. The language pattern was wrong for that. The cadence, the spacing of words. American. Military. Someone had followed her. She waited until they were close enough, then made a sound with her mouth, a specific click that was part of a contact protocol her old unit had used in the field. 3 years out of that unit, and she still defaulted to it without thinking. The movement stopped instantly. A whisper came back. Reeves. She knew the voice. Corporal Darius Webb, 24 years old, from Atlanta, the best natural navigator she had ever worked with, and also the most quietly stubborn human being she had encountered in uniform. He had been in her previous unit before both of them were reassigned. A second shape materialized beside him. Smaller. Medic's kit on her back. Private First Class Sarah Okafor, 22. Calm under pressure in a way that seemed almost unnatural for her age. Maya looked at them both for a long moment in the dark. "You were not supposed to be here," she said. Her voice was barely a breath. "No," Webb agreed, "but here we are." She wanted to send them back. She ran the calculation in her head, the time it would take, the additional noise, the risk of movement in the open. Then she ran a different calculation, what the next 4 hours would require and whether she had actually believed she could do it entirely alone. She looked back up at the ridgeline. The chair was still dark. "Stay behind me," she said. "Match every step exactly. Don't speak unless I speak first, and if I go down," she looked at Webb, "you finish it." Webb nodded without hesitation. Okafor checked her kit strap once quietly, and then she was still. Maya turned back toward the gully and began to climb. The gully was worse than it looked. That was almost always true of terrains studied from a distance. Maps gave you shape and elevation, but they didn't give you the loose shale that shifted under your boot like something alive, or the sections where the rock face angled outward and forced you to lean back over open air with nothing below you but darkness and the valley floor 60 feet down. Maya climbed slowly, testing each hold before committing weight. Her fingers found cracks and edges in the rock that she couldn't see but could feel. A kind of reading she had developed over years in terrain like this, a conversation between her hands and the mountain that happened below the level of conscious thought. Behind her, Webb moved well. She had expected that. He was bigger than her by 40 pounds, but he had good instincts about where to place his body, and he trusted her route without questioning it, which was the thing she needed most from him right now. Okafor was the surprise. The medic climbed with a quietness that seemed almost practiced. Not the quietness of training, but the quietness of someone who had grown up moving carefully through spaces where making noise had consequences. Maya filed that away without comment. They reached the first ledge at the 20-minute mark. Maya pressed against the rock wall and held up a closed fist. Both of them stopped immediately. She counted to 30, scanning the ridgeline above with slow, deliberate eye movements, never staring at one point, always moving, because the eye detects motion in the periphery far better than it detects static shapes when staring directly. Nothing moved above them. She turned and pointed 2 fingers at her eyes, then pointed up and right, toward the position below the chair where she had seen the cigarette ember. Then she held up 1 finger, 1 person. Then she made a flat pushing gesture with her palm. "Stay here. Watch that position." Webb nodded. She pointed at Okafor, then at the ground beside Webb. Same message. Then she turned and continued climbing alone. The next section was the most exposed, a traverse across open rock face that offered no vertical cover for approximately 15 meters. If the observer above happened to look down at the wrong angle at the wrong moment, she would be visible, even in the dark. Not clearly, but enough. She moved across it in 4 deliberate stages, freezing between each one, becoming part of the rock in her stillness. Her heart rate was elevated but controlled. She could feel it in her throat, but not in her hands, which was the line she had always used to measure her own steadiness. Hands calm, she was functional. Hands shaking, she needed to stop and reset. Her hands were calm. She cleared the traverse and found a narrow shelf of rock that gave her a horizontal view along the upper ridgeline. From here, she could see the chair formation clearly, a mass of stacked boulders that jutted out from the face like the back of a throne. Below it, in the shadow where she had marked the observer, she could now make out a shape, a man, sitting with his back against the lower boulder, rifle across his knees, head tilted slightly, not asleep, but close to it. The kind of half-consciousness that comes from too many nights on a cold ridge, doing a job that is mostly waiting. She watched him for 3 full minutes without moving. Then she shifted her attention further along the ridge, northeast, toward where the mortar position should be according to the acoustic signature she had been tracking and the map geometry she had worked out in her bunk. From this elevation, she could see the ridgeline flatten into a shelf, a natural platform protected on 3 sides, exactly the kind of position a competent unit would choose for a fixed mortar installation. She couldn't see the tube from here, but she could see something else. Light. A very faint, directed light, the kind that comes from a covered torch being used inside a small enclosed area. It appeared and disappeared in a rhythm that suggested 2 or 3 people moving around a confined area. The mortar team was awake. She had hoped they would be resting between fire missions. They were not. That complicated the approach significantly. A resting team with 1 watch meant 1 conscious person to account for. An active team was a different problem. She climbed back down to the ledge where Webb and Okafor were waiting. She communicated everything in hand signals and a rough sketch drawn with her fingertip on the flat rock surface between them. The observer's position, the mortar shelf, the distance between them, her estimated count on the mortar team. Webb studied the sketch. Then he held up 3 fingers and raised an eyebrow. She tilted her hand side to side. Maybe 3, maybe 2. The light pattern suggested 3, but she couldn't confirm. He nodded slowly. Then he pointed at himself and made a gesture toward the observer's position. She shook her head. He pointed at himself again, more firmly. She understood what he was offering. He would handle the observer while she moved on the mortar position. Simultaneous neutralization, no warning gap. It was tactically correct. It was also exactly the kind of thing that got people killed when the timing was off by 30 seconds. She looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded. She held up her watch and showed him a time. 15 minutes from now. Whatever happened, that was when they moved. Synchronized, no deviation. He set his own watch without being told. She looked at Okafor. The medic's face was steady. No excitement, no visible fear, just attention. Maya pointed at her and then pointed at the ledge. Stay. Hold position. If either of them came back compromised, Okafor would be the reason they made it down the mountain. Okafor put her hand flat on the rock once. Understood. Maya turned and began moving along the traverse again, this time heading northeast toward the mortar shelf. The wind had picked up slightly, enough to cover minor sound, which was good. It was also cold enough now that her fingers were losing fine sensation, which was a problem she noted and accepted and moved past. The shelf was 200 meters along the ridge and 40 meters higher. She covered the distance in 11 minutes. At the edge of the shelf, she went flat on her stomach and crawled the last 8 meters to a position where she could see down into the mortar pit. 3 men. She had been right. 1 was crouched over the tube making adjustments, an experienced motion, practiced and efficient. 1 was sitting on an ammunition crate with a radio handset, waiting. The 3rd was standing at the northern edge of the shelf, looking out over the valley with a pair of binoculars. The standing man was the problem. His angle of view covered the approach she had used. If he turned 30 degrees left and looked down, he would see the ledge where Okafor was waiting. She checked her watch. 4 minutes. She needed to move the standing man's attention before the 4 minutes were up, without triggering an alert that would reach the observer before Webb was in position. She reached into her jacket pocket and found what she needed, a small piece of shale she had picked up from the gully during the climb without quite knowing why, the way she often picked things up without knowing why and found uses for them later. She weighed it in her palm. She looked at the far northern wall of the shelf, where a natural overhang created an echo point. She threw the shale hard and flat, well above the shelf, toward the overhang. The sound it made when it hit was ambiguous. Rock on rock, which was common enough on a ridge that it didn't spike alarm, but unusual enough that it pulled attention. The standing man turned north immediately, binoculars going up. His back was now to the ledge. 2 minutes. Maya moved off her stomach and into a crouch. 1 minute. She thought about the briefing room, about the laughing, about General Cole's face when she raised her hand and the way Briggs had looked at her like she was a problem that had wandered in from another department. She thought about the 12 men who had come into this valley and not come back out. Then she stopped thinking entirely. 30 seconds. She moved. She moved onto the shelf like water finding a crack in stone. Not fast, precise. There is a difference that most people never learn because speed feels like safety and precision feels like hesitation. But in a space this small, with 3 armed men and a 4-minute window, speed without precision was just a faster way to die. The man crouching over the mortar tube heard nothing. The man on the radio heard nothing. The man at the northern edge was still looking at the overhang where the shale had hit, binoculars up, trying to resolve a sound that had already dissolved into the wind. He would look for another 20 seconds before deciding it was nothing. Maya knew this because she had watched enough men in enough tense situations to understand that the human brain always gives itself slightly too long to confirm what it already suspects, that the threat isn't real, that it was just the mountain, that everything is still under control. 20 seconds was enough. She was not going to reconstruct every detail of what happened on that shelf in the next 4 minutes. Some things that happen in combat belong to the people who were there and no one else, not because they are shameful, but because language makes them smaller than they are, flattens them into something that can be processed over breakfast or forgotten by evening. What happened on that shelf was not that kind of thing. What can be said is this. At the 43-second mark, the radio handset fell onto the rock without transmitting. At the 2-minute 12-second mark, the mortar tube was no longer operational. At 3 minutes and 51 seconds, Maya was flat against the northern wall of the shelf with her breathing controlled and her hands still steady. And the shelf was quiet in the way that a space becomes quiet when the thing that was happening in it has finished. She checked the radio unit. 1 transmission had been attempted, a partial, less than 2 seconds, interrupted before a full signal could be established. She didn't know if it had reached anyone. She had to operate as though it had. She clicked her radio twice, the signal Webb was waiting for. 1 click came back immediately. She released a breath she had not been aware she was holding. She moved back to the edge of the shelf and looked down the ridgeline toward the chair formation. From this angle, she could see the area below it where the observer had been positioned. There was no movement, no shape against the rock. Webb had done his part. She began moving back along the traverse, faster now. The window for being careful had closed, and the window for being quick had opened. These were different modes, and the transition between them had to be clean, or you carried the wrong energy into the wrong situation. She reached the ledge in 6 minutes. Okafor was exactly where she had left her. Webb arrived from the upper route 90 seconds later, moving low and fast, and when he reached the ledge, he looked at Maya once, and she looked at him, and nothing needed to be said about what either of them had just done, because they were both still standing on that mountain, and that was the only accounting that mattered right now. "We need to move," Maya said. Her voice came out quieter than she expected. "The observer had a backup radio," Webb said. "He didn't use it. I don't know if that means the transmission from the shelf didn't reach him or if he just didn't have time." "We assume it reached someone," Maya said. "Move." They went down the gully faster than they had climbed it. Okafor descended with the same quiet competence she had shown on the way up, never grabbing at Webb or Maya for support, finding her own holds, managing her own weight. On the valley floor, they moved in a tight 3-person formation. Maya on point, Webb covering their rear, Okafor in the center with her kit drawn close. They were 2 kilometers from the base perimeter when the first light came. Not sunrise, too early and too directional for that. A spotlight from somewhere on the ridge behind them. The enemy had sent someone to the shelf and found what was on it, and now they were looking. "Don't run," Maya said quietly. "Walk fast. Running silhouette is different from walking silhouette at this distance." They walked fast. The spotlight swept the valley in long arcs. It passed over them once. Maya felt it on the back of her neck like a physical thing, a half-second of exposure, and then moved on. Either they hadn't been resolved against the terrain, or whoever was operating the light was looking for a different kind of movement. They reached the outer wire at 0551. Maya found the camera gap. 12 seconds. They moved through in pairs, Webb and Okafor first, then Maya, and then she was inside the perimeter, and the wire was behind her, and the mountain was behind that, and the shelf was behind everything. She stood still for a moment in the dark between the wire and the first row of structures. Her hands were still calm. She checked them deliberately, the way she always did, and they were still calm, and she filed that information and moved on. General Cole was in the operations center when they came through the door. He was standing over a communications console with two of his staff officers, and when he turned and saw Maya, still in her full kit, face marked with dust and cold, Webb and Okafor directly behind her, something moved across his face that was not quite any single expression, but contained parts of several. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the clock on the wall. 0557. "The mortar position?" he said, not a question. "Neutralized," Maya said. "Observer on the eastern ridge also. There may have been a partial transmission from the shelf before we finished. Recommend we move the medical unit out of the eastern quarter as a precaution and get eyes on the ridge at first light." Cole looked at her for another long moment. Then he turned to his staff officer. "Get eyes on that ridge and move the medical unit." He turned back. "Sit down, Lieutenant." "I'm fine, sir." "That wasn't a welfare suggestion," he said. "Sit down." She sat. Cole pulled a chair across from her and sat in it himself, which was not something she had ever seen him do in an operations center. He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, a posture that removed about 40 years of rank from his bearing and left something more basic behind. "You went out without authorization," he said. "Yes, sir." "You took 2 personnel with you who also went out without authorization." "They followed without my knowledge, sir. That's accurate." Cole looked at Webb, who was standing by the door. Webb met his eyes without flinching. "Why?" Cole asked. The question was directed at Maya, but his eyes moved between all 3 of them. Maya thought about how to answer that. She thought about the 12 men who hadn't come back. She thought about the medical unit in the eastern quarter. She thought about the mortar that would have fired in approximately 15 hours if the shelf had still been operational. "Because Thursday was too late, sir," she said. The operations center was quiet around them. The hum of equipment, the distant sound of the base beginning to wake up outside. Cole looked at the floor for a moment. Then he looked back at her. "There will be a formal review," he said. "I understand, sir. It will be thorough, and it will be uncomfortable." "Yes, sir." He stood up, straightened his jacket. The 40 years came back into his posture as he did it, rank resettling on him like a coat. He looked down at her with an expression she couldn't quite read and had the feeling she wasn't supposed to be able to read. "Get cleaned up. Eat something." He walked back to the communications console without another word. Maya sat in the chair for another moment. Okafor had already found a corner and was checking her kit inventory with the focused calm of someone who processes things by doing rather than reflecting. Webb was still by the door. He caught Maya's eye and gave her a single small nod, the kind of nod that carries a whole conversation inside it. She nodded back. Then she stood up, adjusted her kit, and walked out of the operations center into the early morning light. The mountains were pale and enormous against the sky. The valley was invisible from here, just a gap between the ridge lines, a shadow between shapes. You would never know, looking at it from this distance, what it held, what it had taken from people, what had happened inside it in the last few hours. She looked at it for a moment anyway. Then she turned away and walked toward the mess hall because she was cold and she was hungry, and the review board could have whatever it needed from her, but right now she needed coffee and she had earned it. Behind her, somewhere on the eastern ridge, the first light of sunrise was touching the chair formation, that stack of boulders she had named in her head during planning, alone in her bunk, before anyone had laughed and before she had walked out into the dark. It looked different in daylight. Smaller, more ordinary. Just rock on rock on rock, the way mountains always are when the night lifts and you can finally see them for what they are. Maya didn't ask for recognition. She didn't wait for permission. She looked at a problem that everyone else had decided was someone else's responsibility, and she walked toward it in the dark. There are people like that in the world. Not many, but they exist. If this story stayed with you, if something in Maya's walk out that gate at 0230 felt familiar or felt like something you needed to see, then you already know why these stories matter. Hit that subscribe button. Every day we bring you stories like this one. Stories about men and women who faced the moment no one else wanted to face, and what it cost them, and what it made them. Leave a comment below. Tell us one word that describes Maya. Just one word. We read every single one. And if you know someone who needs to hear a story like this today, share this video. Don't explain it, just send it. They'll understand when it's done. We'll see you in the next one.